Listen carefully, because what unfolds today is not ordinary energy, and deep down, part of you already knows that. May 25th carries one of the most emotionally destabilizing and psychologically revealing alignments of this entire year. Yet most people are walking into it, completely unconscious of what is being activated beneath the surface of their own minds. This is not just another passing transit that creates temporary mood swings or strange emotions you can brush aside tomorrow morning. This is a direct confrontation between the version of yourself you present to the world and the hidden self you've spent years trying to silence. Today, Mercury, the planet connected to thought patterns, speech, perception, and the structure of the conscious mind, moves into an exact opposition with Black Moon Lilith, the force within the psyche that governs everything rejected, buried, denied, or emotionally exiled. And what makes this moment so powerful is that this energy does not politely knock before entering your life. It erupts, it exposes, it forces recognition. Truths that have remained trapped beneath the surface are no longer willing to stay hidden in darkness. And whether you feel ready or not, something inside you is beginning to rise. You may have already noticed the signs without understanding why they feel so intense. Conversations may suddenly feel heavier than normal, as if every word contains an invisible emotional charge underneath it. Thoughts you normally suppress may have started surfacing unexpectedly, shocking you with their honesty. Maybe you have found yourself holding back during discussions because part of you senses that if you truly said what you were thinking, everything could change in an instant. Or maybe the opposite is happening and you are reaching a breaking point where silence no longer feels possible. There may even be a strange sensation building physically in your throat and chest, like unspoken words are gathering pressure inside your body, waiting for the exact moment they can no longer be contained. That sensation is not random. There is a very specific reason this energy is affecting you so personally right now, and understanding it changes everything. But before we get there, you need to see the larger picture, because the next 48 hours are not isolated from the rest of the year. They are the ignition point for a much larger psychological awakening already in motion. This is not simply one transit acting alone. This is the trigger that activates a chain reaction capable of transforming the way you communicate, the beliefs you defend, the truths you avoid, and the identity you allow yourself to embody. The universe has been preparing your mind for this confrontation step by step, even if you did not realize it at the time. Just over a week ago, on May 16th, the new moon in Taurus arrived as a grounding force, stabilizing emotions and slowing the pace of life long enough for people to regain a sense of internal security. But almost immediately afterward, everything shifted. On May 17th, Mercury entered Gemini, its home sign, and the entire mental atmosphere accelerated. Thoughts became faster, conversations multiplied, information started arriving constantly from every direction at once. It became harder to turn the mind off because the mind itself was becoming overstimulated by the speed of incoming insight. But this was never just about Mercury entering Gemini. The real activation happened because Mercury collided with Uranus the very same day. That conjunction altered the nervous system on a deep, energetic level. It cracked open mental pathways that had previously remained dormant. Suddenly, people began noticing patterns hidden beneath ordinary reality, connections between events that previously seemed unrelated, realizations emerging so quickly they almost felt overwhelming. Over the past week, your mind has likely been operating at a frequency that feels difficult to explain to other people. Downloads of insight, flashes of recognition, emotional revelations, intuitive messages, vivid dreams, sudden understandings, all of it building pressure beneath the surface. And none of it was accidental. Every realization, every restless night, every moment where your mind refused to slow down has been preparing you for what happens today. Because at exactly 10:10 in the evening, Mercury, in Gemini, forms a perfect 180-degree opposition with Black Moon Lilith in Sagittarius. And when the planet ruling conscious awareness stares directly across the sky into the realm of the shadow self, the tension becomes impossible to ignore. Something hidden always rises during a transit like this. Something buried always demands acknowledgement. What most people misunderstand about Black Moon Lilith is that she is not simply a dark feminine archetype or an abstract spiritual symbol. She represents the deepest point of exile within the human psyche. Astronomically, Lilith is the lunar apogee, the point where the moon reaches its maximum distance from Earth. Symbolically, that distance becomes emotional exile, psychological isolation, the parts of yourself separated from acceptance and pushed into darkness. Lilith governs the desires you were taught to suppress, the anger you learned to swallow to keep the peace, the opinions you hide to avoid rejection, the truths you censor, because they threaten the identity you built for survival. She is the inner voice that refuses domestication. The part of you that sees through comforting illusions and recognizes where you have betrayed your own authenticity in order to remain accepted by others. Since entering Sagittarius late last year, Lilith has been exposing areas where people have compromised their beliefs, silenced their philosophies, minimized their truth, or pretended agreement with systems and ideas they fundamentally reject internally. And now Mercury, the socially conditioned rational mind, must directly face that suppressed truth across the opposition line. This is why the emotional intensity feels so personal right now. This is why your nervous system may already feel overstimulated before the transit even perfects. You may notice the electric sensation beneath your skin, the racing thoughts that refuse to settle, the repetitive mental loops, the difficulty falling asleep, or the strange, vivid dreams that leave emotional residue long after waking. Many people will call this anxiety because they do not understand what is actually happening. But energetically, this is something much deeper. Mercury rules the nervous system itself. And when Mercury opposes Lilith, the entire internal communication network of the psyche becomes activated at once. Hidden material rises rapidly from the unconscious mind into conscious awareness. Thoughts you avoided suddenly become impossible to ignore. Emotional truths you buried start demanding language. Your system begins rewiring itself around honesty, and that process can feel overwhelming because awakening rarely arrives gently. It arrives like pressure building beneath the surface until the soul can no longer tolerate pretending. And what makes this transit so powerful is that once you finally see the truth Lilith has been trying to show you, you cannot unsee it again. You may already feel it happening inside your body before you can logically explain it. The nervous system becomes so overstimulated under this energy that even ordinary experiences start feeling unbearable. Sounds seem sharper than usual. Crowded places drain you almost instantly. Notifications, conversations, constant scrolling, all of it begins to feel invasive, like your mind can no longer tolerate unnecessary noise entering your field. And what most people fail to understand is that this hypersensitivity is not weakness. It is preparation. Your system is attempting to protect your clarity because something buried deep within the psyche is preparing to speak. And when the shadow finally rises to the surface, it does not arrive gently or politely. It does not wait for the perfect moment. It does not ask permission before exposing the truth. Everything you have been suppressing emotionally and verbally begins pushing upward at once. Earlier, I mentioned that strange pressure building in the throat, that sensation of words trapped beneath the surface waiting for release. This is the reason. Mercury in Gemini is fueled by expression. It wants movement, conversation, confession, dialogue, revelation. It accelerates the mind and pushes thoughts toward language almost compulsively. But directly opposite sits Black Moon Lilith in Sagittarius, holding the truths you considered too dangerous to admit openly, the beliefs you were taught would make people uncomfortable, the opinions you learned to hide because they threatened acceptance, stability, or belonging. And today, when these two archetypal forces collide across the sky, the emotional pressure becomes impossible to contain. The words you swallowed to survive begin forcing their way upward. What makes this transit especially volatile is that your usual mechanisms of self-control stop functioning normally. The internal filter you developed over years of social conditioning begins to destabilize. The careful calculation that normally determines what should be spoken and what should remain hidden starts breaking apart under the intensity of this opposition. For some people, the result will be total silence. Fear of what might emerge becomes so overwhelming that they withdraw inward completely, censoring themselves so aggressively they can barely communicate at all. They will feel trapped between the need to express and the terror of the consequences expression might bring. But for others, the opposite happens. Thoughts spill out before they can be managed. Emotional truths escape without warning. The forbidden sentence finally gets spoken aloud. The opinion they promised themselves they would never reveal suddenly becomes impossible to hold back any longer. And the moment those words leave the mouth, there is no returning to the previous version of reality. Because this is the nature of a Mercury-Lilith opposition, it does not prioritize diplomacy. It does not offer the luxury of carefully rehearsed timing. It tears away the illusion of control and demands authenticity in its rawest form, even when authenticity threatens comfort, relationships, or identity itself. This is why so many people will experience shocking confrontations during this transit, not because the energy is trying to destroy their lives, but because suppressed truth eventually becomes too heavy to carry silently. And what becomes even more intense is the realization that this opposition is not only unfolding internally, it is manifesting through the people around you. Oppositions in astrology almost always externalize themselves through relationships, reflections, projections, and emotional mirrors, which means the individuals triggering you right now are not appearing accidentally. They are revealing something hidden inside your own psyche. Pay attention to the people who provoke strong emotional reactions in you today, because they are carrying pieces of your shadow back into your awareness. Maybe there is someone in your life whose blunt honesty irritates you deeply, someone who says whatever they think without filtering it, someone reckless with truth in a way that makes you uncomfortable. What if the intensity of your reaction is not actually about them? What if they are reflecting the untamed part of yourself you abandoned long ago in order to become acceptable? Their freedom becomes irritating because it reminds you of your own repression. Or perhaps the reflection appears differently. Maybe you encounter someone manipulative, intellectually controlling, emotionally calculating with language, someone who twists communication into a weapon. You may feel immediate judgment, anger, disgust. But hidden beneath that reaction is an uncomfortable shadow truth. Somewhere within you exists the capacity for the same behavior. The difference is only that you buried it deeply enough to convince yourself it no longer exists. This transit strips away that illusion. Under Mercury opposite Lilith, the people who trigger emotional intensity become mirrors exposing what has been disowned within yourself. They reveal the traits, impulses, desires, fears, and emotional capacities you pushed into darkness because acknowledging them threatened the identity you preferred to maintain consciously. And the confrontations arising today are not meaningless conflict. They are initiations into self-recognition. They are the psyche, demanding reintegration. The shadow is no longer willing to remain fragmented and unheard. What intensifies this energy even further is the deeper karmic layer unfolding simultaneously behind the scenes. Most people discussing this transit will never mention this part, yet it completely changes the meaning of what is happening. The Mercury-Lilith opposition is not occurring alone in isolation. Just 4 minutes before the opposition becomes exact, at 5:01 in the afternoon, the Sun in Gemini forms an exact square to the lunar nodes. In astrology, The nodes represent the soul path, the evolutionary direction between past conditioning and future growth. When the sun forms a square to them, it creates what astrologers often call a skipped step, a karmic pressure point where unresolved lessons resurface because they can no longer be bypassed. It is a moment where avoidance collapses. Old patterns demand confrontation. Incomplete psychological development rises back into awareness, asking to finally be completed consciously. And the timing of this configuration matters deeply. The fact that the Sun squares the nodes only 4 minutes before Mercury opposes Lilith is not random cosmic background noise. It creates a direct link between karmic evolution and shadow revelation. The emotional material surfacing now is not meaningless chaos. The uncomfortable truths pressing against your consciousness are not distractions pulling you away from your destiny. They are the very doorway into it. The conversations demanding honesty, the realizations making you uncomfortable, the emotional reactions exposing hidden wounds. All of it is connected to the exact growth your soul has been resisting. Because sometimes the greatest obstacle blocking your future is not external circumstances. It is the version of yourself you have been pretending to be in order to avoid confronting the truth buried underneath. This is the part most people resist hearing because it changes the entire meaning of what is happening to them right now. The truths rising to the surface are not distractions from your path. They are the path itself. Evolution cannot happen while silence continues protecting the false version of who you have been pretending to be. The soul cannot move forward while the most honest parts of the psyche remain buried underneath fear, shame, or social conditioning. And today, that buried truth reaches a point where it refuses invisibility any longer. At exactly 1:10 in the afternoon, Mercury and Black Moon Lilith arrive at a perfect opposition at 17 degrees and 28 minutes of Gemini and Sagittarius. This is the climax of the psychological pressure that has been building beneath the surface throughout the entire week. The tension reaches its peak here. The emotional charge becomes impossible to compartmentalize. For some people, this exact moment will arrive internally as a realization so undeniable that it changes the way they see themselves forever. A hidden truth about a relationship, a desire, a belief, a resentment, or an identity suddenly becomes impossible to deny consciously. Others will experience it externally through conversations that unexpectedly rupture the carefully controlled surface of ordinary interaction. A discussion that begins normally may suddenly shift tone without warning. Someone says a sentence that cuts directly into your unconscious, or perhaps you become the one speaking words that shock even you as they leave your mouth. There may even be moments where no words are spoken at all, only a heavy silence hanging between two people, while both silently recognize that something fundamental has changed underneath the surface. This is what happens when the conscious mind finally makes direct contact with the shadow self. The energy is electric because the psyche is no longer fragmented. Hidden truth collides directly with conscious awareness, and that collision is impossible to ignore once it occurs. Some individuals will suddenly confess emotions or secrets they have hidden for months or years. Others will finally state boundaries they were previously terrified to enforce. Others may reveal beliefs or opinions they spent enormous energy suppressing simply because Lilith no longer accepts containment. And what matters most is understanding that whatever emerges today carries truth within it. It may arrive chaotically. It may create discomfort. It may complicate situations that once felt stable. But the emotional honesty underneath it is real. These truths have existed inside the psyche long before today. This transit simply removes the barriers preventing acknowledgement. But what makes this energy even more intense is realizing that the Mercury-Lilith opposition is not the conclusion of the story. It is only the opening rupture. Because just 11 hours later, at midnight on May 26th, Mars in Taurus forms a square with Pluto in Aquarius, and this second transit changes everything physically. Mars governs action, survival instinct, confrontation, aggression, decisive movement, and the force required to sever attachment. Pluto governs power, transformation, death, rebirth, and the destruction of structures that can no longer sustain evolution. When these two planets collide through a square, especially across fixed signs like Taurus and Aquarius, pressure becomes unbearable. Something breaks under the weight of resistance. Something reaches the point where it can no longer continue in its current form, and the connection between these transits is crucial. The truth revealed during the Mercury-Lilith opposition becomes the catalyst that allows the Mars-Pluto square to manifest externally. Once the forbidden truth has been spoken, once the shadow has been recognized consciously, physical reality itself must begin reorganizing around that honesty. This is why some relationships may suddenly collapse in the hours following this transit. This is why certain people may walk away from jobs, environments, or situations they previously tolerated. This is why irreversible choices may be made suddenly under this energy. The realization that occurs mentally at 1:10 in the afternoon demands action by midnight. The psyche acknowledges the truth first, then the physical world restructures itself around it afterward. Once Lilith exposes reality beneath illusion, there is no returning to unconsciousness. Mars and Pluto ensure movement follows recognition. You cannot unknow what the shadow reveals once it reaches conscious awareness. And this brings us back to that strange pressure in the throat that so many people have been feeling without understanding why. Earlier, I mentioned that this sensation carried meaning beyond ordinary stress, and now the deeper reason becomes visible. Within the body, Mercury governs the throat, the vocal cords, the entire energetic mechanism connected to communication and expression. When Mercury opposes Lilith, the body often manifests physical sensations connected to suppressed speech. It can feel like tightness in the throat, blocked expression, constriction in the chest, or the strange sensation that words are trapped inside the body, attempting to force their way outward. This is not imagined. It is the nervous system, translating psychological repression into physical sensation. The shadow wants expression. The unconscious mind is attempting to move hidden truth into language, while the conscious self tightens control out of fear of consequence. The result becomes that choking emotional pressure so many people are carrying right now. And, if you have been experiencing it, your body is trying to communicate something important to you. It already knows expression is necessary. It already senses that truth needs release. The only uncertainty remaining is whether you will allow that release consciously or whether repression will continue until the truth erupts uncontrollably at the worst possible moment. This is why the next 24 hours matter so deeply. The healthiest thing you can do under this transit is create intentional space for uncensored expression before the pressure chooses its own outlet. Write thoughts down without editing them. Speak honestly out loud when alone. Allow uncomfortable realizations to rise privately instead of forcing them deeper into suppression. Because if hidden emotion is denied safe expression, it eventually finds chaotic expression instead. And under Mercury opposite Lilith, suppressed truth tends to erupt during the exact conversations where consequences matter most. But hidden within all of this intensity is a powerful gift that many people will completely overlook because they are too focused on the discomfort itself. When Mercury connects with Lilith, even through opposition, the mind gains temporary access to a deeper form of intelligence that normally remains inaccessible beneath everyday consciousness. This is instinctive intelligence, somatic intelligence, the ability to sense truth without requiring logical evidence. It is the body reading energy before the rational mind catches up intellectually. Some call this shadow language, the capacity to perceive the hidden emotional subtext beneath surface communication. And today, this sensitivity becomes amplified to an almost unsettling degree. You may suddenly recognize dishonesty before facts confirm it. You may feel tension underneath someone's words, even when they appear calm externally. You may intuit motives, emotional manipulation, fear, attraction, resentment, or hidden agendas long before anyone verbalizes them openly. Because under this transit, the unconscious mind becomes impossible to fool. What makes this energy so unsettling is that your perception sharpens beyond ordinary logic. Under this opposition, you are no longer just listening to what people say. You are hearing the hesitation underneath their words, sensing the emotion hidden behind their tone, recognizing the intention buried beneath carefully constructed sentences. Manipulation becomes easier to detect because the unconscious mind starts reading patterns that the conscious mind usually overlooks. You may suddenly realize that someone has been performing a version of themselves around you, and for the first time you can see the cracks in the performance clearly. Facades that once looked convincing begin collapsing under your awareness. It is almost like discovering a hidden language woven beneath everyday interaction, a code that was always present but invisible until now. And if you learn how to work with this energy consciously instead of fearing it, something remarkable happens. Mercury connected to Lilith creates a voice people cannot ignore. You become the person capable of articulating truths others secretly feel but are too afraid to express openly. Your words begin carrying emotional electricity because they cut through illusion and touch something real inside the people listening. Entire rooms can shift because one honest sentence changes the emotional atmosphere instantly. But this is also where the danger exists, because shadow language is powerful. It can expose truth in a way that liberates people emotionally, or it can wound with surgical precision. It can heal buried shame, or it can weaponize pain. The same awareness that allows you to perceive hidden emotional currents can also tempt you to use that perception destructively. And that is why this transit demands consciousness. The real question is not whether you will gain access to deeper psychological insight today. You will. The question is whether you will use that awareness to create honesty and integration, or whether unresolved pain will turn that intelligence into emotional warfare. There are several mistakes people commonly make during a Mercury-Lilith opposition, and becoming aware of them beforehand can completely change how this transit unfolds in your life. The first mistake is over-intellectualizing the shadow. Gemini energy naturally wants to analyze everything mentally, organize emotions into neat categories, and rationalize uncomfortable experiences into concepts that feel manageable. But Lilith cannot be understood purely through logic. Shadow material is felt before it is explained. If you try to dissect every emotional reaction intellectually, without actually allowing yourself to experience what is moving beneath the surface, you miss the entire purpose of the transit. The shadow is not asking for perfect analysis. It is asking for honest acknowledgement. The second mistake is total suppression. Some people become so frightened by the intensity of what rises emotionally that they shut down completely. They avoid difficult conversations, silence themselves, disconnect emotionally, and attempt to control the energy through repression. But suppressed truth does not disappear. It simply changes form. What is denied consciously eventually emerges indirectly through projection, passive aggression, resentment, emotional sabotage, or psychological fragmentation. Refusing to engage with shadow material only guarantees it will manifest unconsciously later. The third mistake is impulsive. Emotional eruption disguised as authenticity. Yes, this transit demands honesty. Yes, your voice matters. But authentic expression and uncontrolled emotional discharge are not the same thing. Before speaking today, there needs to be a moment of internal pause. Ask yourself whether the words rising inside you are emerging from clarity or from wounded reaction. ask whether your intention is healing or punishment. The goal of this transit is not reckless confession or emotional destruction. The goal is integrated truth. Sometimes the most powerful honesty is not speaking every thought impulsively, but understanding which truth actually needs to be voiced and how it can be expressed in a way that creates transformation instead of unnecessary damage. So what should you actually do with this energy on May 25th? First, understand that communication throughout the day carries unusual emotional charge. Conversations may become deeper unexpectedly. Simple exchanges may suddenly reveal hidden tension beneath the surface. Stay emotionally present. Listen carefully, not only to the words people use, but to the emotional subtext underneath them. Pay attention to what remains unsaid, because silence itself will communicate powerfully under this transit. Second, intentionally create space for shadow work. This is not the day to distract yourself endlessly with noise or external stimulation. This is the day to sit with yourself honestly. Journal without editing your thoughts. Allow uncomfortable emotions to surface privately. Ask yourself difficult questions. What truth have you been afraid to admit? What belief have you silenced to maintain acceptance? What part of your voice have you abandoned in order to keep peace with others? Let your answers arrive without judgment. They do not need to sound polished. They only need to be real. Third, observe your emotional triggers instead of reacting automatically to them. If someone provokes intense irritation or emotional discomfort today, investigate why. Ask yourself what aspect of your own shadow they may be reflecting back to you. The people who create the strongest emotional reactions are often mirroring traits, desires, fears, or emotional capacities you have rejected within yourself. Under this transit, your greatest triggers can become your greatest psychological teachers if you are willing to look honestly. Fourth, if there is a difficult conversation you have been avoiding, this energy may actually support finally having it. The emotional atmosphere is already volatile and truth-oriented. Sometimes honesty becomes easier during intense transits because the pressure to maintain illusion weakens dramatically. But understand clearly that once certain truths are spoken, relationships cannot always return to their previous form. Make sure you are emotionally prepared for transformation before opening doors that cannot easily be closed again. And finally, protect your nervous system intentionally. This transit is psychologically exhausting because the mind is processing enormous amounts of unconscious material rapidly. You do not need to remain constantly available to everyone. Give yourself permission to step back from overstimulation. Rest, sit in silence, disconnect from unnecessary noise. The shadow often reveals its deepest truths in quiet moments where the nervous system finally feels safe enough to listen internally. And what happens over the next week matters just as much as the transit itself, because this energy does not end immediately on May 26th. The truth spoken today initiates a chain reaction that continues unfolding over the days ahead. As the collective moves toward the full moon in Sagittarius on May 31st, the second full moon of the month, everything revealed on May 25th becomes even more illuminated emotionally. You begin seeing the consequences of honesty clearly. Some relationships deepen because authenticity strengthens the foundation underneath them. Others dissolve because they were sustained only through silence, performance, or carefully maintained illusions. You may notice opportunities opening in areas where you finally admitted what you truly want, instead of pretending satisfaction with less. The shadow material surfacing now is not a temporary emotional episode. It is the beginning of reclamation. You are recovering the parts of yourself you abandoned in exchange for acceptance, safety, approval, or love. And reclamation is never perfectly clean or linear. It is emotional. It is uncomfortable. It is deeply necessary. Because what is really unfolding on May 25th goes far beyond communication itself. This transit is ultimately about integration. It is about making peace with the aspects of yourself you were conditioned to fear or reject, the anger you were taught to suppress, the desires you considered unacceptable, the thoughts you labeled dangerous, the emotional intensity you tried to domesticate. Lilith represents the untamed self, the aspect of your nature that refuses complete control, refuses performance, refuses emotional imprisonment. And when Lilith opposes Mercury, the rational mind is forced to recognize that this wildness contains wisdom rather than destruction alone. Your shadow is not your enemy. In many ways, it has been protecting the most authentic parts of you from a world that may not have known how to receive them safely. And today, you stand at a threshold where you must decide whether you are finally ready to stop abandoning those parts of yourself. The world may not fully understand the real version of you immediately, but what matters now is that you begin understanding and accepting it yourself. Because once the shadow finally speaks and the conscious mind truly listens, there is no returning to the comforting illusions that once kept you emotionally asleep. At 1:10 in the afternoon on May 25th, 2026, your real voice begins emerging from beneath the silence. And whatever truth it carries will ripple through every area of your life for months afterward. The only real question is whether you will meet that moment consciously or whether it will catch you completely unprepared.